Okay, today we're going to talk about chapter 8. And I want to share my screen with you. And I'm going to bring up two different PowerPoint presentations when I do this. One's going to focus strictly on the graphs, and hopefully we can clear out any issues you have. Maybe if you had questions in 7, we can resolve them in 8 as well. So let me share the screen with you. Okay. You can see the young man with the backpack is all set up. I'm going to go ahead and go full screen on it. If you have any questions as we're going along with it full screen, I will not be able to see your comments or chat. So just get on your microphone and tell me this. You have a question or a timeout or something. All right. It should be going full screen here. All right. In chapter 8, we're going to bring in the cost of taxation. And with the cost of taxation, we already know based on elasticity that if it's an elastic curve, elastic demand curve, the buyer is going to pay most of the taxes or have to eat them. If it's inelastic, it's going to go directly to the consumer. But this is going to show us with a basic supply and demand curve what happens to consumer and produce a surplus. We already know that demand curve is the price the consumer is willing to pay. Well, let me change the graph. We know the demand curve is the price the consumer is willing to pay. And we can go all the way up and down the curve from where it intercepts the y-axis up top here to this point right here, and it shows that people do demand our products, and as the price goes down, they're willing to buy more. This is the price the sellers are willing to receive. We talked about that in chapter 7 because if they're using generally accepted accounting principles and they're not consuming out of the till or living day by day out of the receipts, if they're using proper accounting methods, that means they're paying themselves a salary, they're taking care of health care, whatever other expenses the business is incurring, and they're able to continue operations, but with a zero profit, no losses, just a profit. So as long as they can sell it and not lose money, they're willing to sell. And that is what was represented with the supply curve. Now, if a tax is implemented, and looking at these two curves, the slope seems to be a fairly equal, 1 and -1, or they may be 0.75 and -0.75, but they're consistent, and the slopes are identical except inverse. When the tax is applied, in this case, it would be 50-50. The buyer would pay half of it, and the seller would pay the other half. So let's say it's $1 tax. The distance between these 2 points is going to represent $1. But from the price without tax to here is going to be 50 cents, and price without tax to what the consumer is willing to pay is also, the difference is 50 cents. Now, anytime the price is not in equilibrium, whether it be high or low, we have a market failure. And here we have the deadweight loss from the taxes. As we talked about in, I think it's chapter 5 with the last 6 years, you know, this ratio can change, and it's all based on the slope of these curves. But if we're looking at just this graph, we can see this area up here, the triangle. That would be the consumer surplus. This area down here would be producer surplus. This would be deadweight loss in this triangle, these two triangles here, these two areas, and this will be revenue to the government. Now, if the government wants to really cause harm in whatever market this may be, maybe they don't like the services we're offering or the product we deliver, what they can do is raise the taxes on it. And every time they raise the taxes, we've already lost this many sellers in the marketplace because of the additional tax. We've lost this many buyers because of the additional tax. If we raise the tax, and even if it's distributed equally, we're going to lose buyers and sellers, and the deadweight loss will increase. Here they show the tax revenue, which is the tax times quantity. So if it's a $2 tax and the quantity goes from 10 to 5, the tax revenue is going to be, let's say tax was 10, be 10 times 5, $50. That'd be the revenue. So it would be the size of the tax times the quantity sold. Here we can break down the cost of taxation. We can look at it graphically and break down each part of this. The consumer surplus without a tax is A, B, and C. The producer surplus without a tax is D, E, and F. So all three of these areas represent the producer surplus because there's individuals willing to sell it lower and they get a higher price, therefore it's a surplus. Now we have no suppliers willing to produce beyond that point, and we have consumers that are not, they're not going to get the product, even though they want it. So once we look at the tax revenue from this first column, there's no tax revenue. And the total surplus would represent all of these points, A, B, C, D, E, and F. Once we implement a tax, the consumer surplus is going to be reduced by removing B and C. A is going to be the only consumer surplus. B will represent revenues for the government, tax revenues. C is deadweight loss. But when we add the tax, remember the tax is added to both parties. And the amount they pay is based on the slope of their curve, or how much they're going to have to pay. Here's the price the sellers will receive here, and here's the price the buyers are willing to pay here. So the final producer surplus will be F. The tax revenue will be B and D. A, B, D, and F represent the total surplus. It doesn't say who gets it, it's just the total surplus. So if we leave the change, consumer surplus is minus B and C, producers minus D and E. Tax revenue is plus B and D, and the total surplus is, although that's the deadweight loss, the change will be minus C and E. Any questions about that?
No, there.
Okay. I'm going to go out of the screen, full screen, so I can see. I can see what's going on as far as anybody has questions I can cover. This is a screen we were just on, the cost of taxation. Now this slide, PowerPoint slideshow, may be a good one to have when you're preparing your test. If you were going to print some things out, these would be ideal to print. They're pretty straight to the point, and it's just the graphs. So go back up here. There's our next slide. So anytime we have a price is above equilibrium or below equilibrium, there's going to be a reduction in Q. It doesn't matter if the price is high, the sellers want to sell it, but or produce it, but the consumer's not going to buy it. That short side domination will apply, and the quantity demand will be reduced. So all this is showing us is the size of the tax, the price without tax, price the sellers will receive, and the price the buyers are willing to pay. It's just like what we saw earlier. Now, lost gains from trade, from taxation, should be, that's this area right here. Let's see if my pen's working now. It's this area right here. That's our deadweight loss. Or some refer to it as a welfare cost. It's most commonly known as deadweight loss. Here we see the situation where the elasticity is different from supply and demand curves. And if we look at these carefully, in the first one, if we draw that price line right through here, we're going to see who's going to pay or have to consume most of that tax. It's going to be the buyer. I mean, the seller is going to really get hit with this. Because even if the price goes up, what the producer or the seller receives is going to continue to decline at a higher rate. Now, on this situation, we have an elastic supply curve. We see who's going to consume most of this. If it's an elastic supply curve, it's going to be the buyer that's going to be paying most of the taxes. If we have an inelastic demand curve, just like with an elastic supply curve, the consumer is going to eat it. They'll have to eat a lot of that tax. It's going to be transferred directly to the consumer. If we have something like a yacht company or something like that, and the taxes are added to it, we see the producer is going to have to eat most of that tax. So if I want to run somebody out of business as a government legislator or agency or whatever, all I have to do is use taxes. I can either run the customers away or I can drive the companies out of business. When we look at cigarettes, both curves were somewhat inelastic. So every time they added a tax, we would see the quantity continue to diminish. We have the tax here, we have an increase in tax here. You see the difference in the change of quantity. And we can take it to the point where nobody even wants the product. Nobody. Now, if we look at this graph right down here, I know there's some true false questions that will deal with this. It may be a multiple choice. And what they're going to ask you is, what is the relationship between deadweight loss and taxes? Or they may ask you, if the taxes are increased, what happens to deadweight loss? All we have to do is refer to what's going on up here. Here, here, and here. This area in the middle is our deadweight loss. And we can see it grows from the first graph to the second graph to the third graph. So if we were just graphing the relationship between increased taxes and deadweight loss, we'll have a curve that is increasing at an increasing rate. If the taxes are completely raised, the deadweight loss is going to be everything. Consumers are going to stop buying it, and producers are going to stop selling it. If it costs the producer $50 to produce the product, and the tax is $55, there's no reason to produce it, because you're having to pay the government just to deliver the product. Now, if that product was just a sub-assembly or a component of a bigger product where there's greater revenues, you would make it just to where you could produce and keep the other ones functioning. One curve that they talk about more in macro than micro is this curve, this Laffer curve. The gentleman's name that produced it he was in the Reagan administration as an economist. His name was Art Laffer, A-R-T Laffer, L-A-F-F-E-R, just like the curve. And he originally drew this on a napkin in a discussion trying to explain taxes and how the markets responded to the taxes. Now, if we look at this graph, it's a parabola. It's a well-defined, excuse my messed up lines. We see a transition point between these curves. It goes from increasing at a decreasing rate, from 0 to here, to decreasing at an increasing rate. And the way he set it up and explained it was the different politicians or political groups, they all perceive this curve to be different. And they also perceive they're in different locations. If you are, at the time this was created, the liberal politicians believed we were on this side of the curve. And if we increase the taxes, we'll increase revenue. So they believe that this is where we were located at on the curve. And to increase government revenue, we have to raise the taxes. Now, the conservatives at the time, they believe we're over here. And they believe if you reduce taxes, we'll see the revenue rise. So a decrease in taxes, increase in revenue. Problem is, we don't know if this curve is skewed like this, or it's like this, or if it's very steep. There's no numbers that actually are represented in this graph. This is a normative statement. But all it wants to do is to explain to everyone that if you charge no taxes, your government revenue will be zero. If you charge a 100% tax rate, nobody's going to work. If you tax me at 100%, unless you threaten me with physical harm, I'm not going to work. Because I can make just as much money sitting out in my front yard fishing in the pond or in the ditch and selling fish in the black market, so I don't have to pay taxes. So there are 2 points that are absolutely accurate. If you tax at 0% or 100%, your tax revenue is going to be zero. The big argument is, where do we exist on this curve? And that argument's been going on for many years. Ever since Laffer came up with the curve. Now, there's been several occasions where the tax rate was lowered. So in several periods of time, we saw a decrease in taxes. So a decrease in taxes, we saw an increase in revenue. The first one would have been under JFK. The top tax rate was around 90%, and they reduced it to just over 70%. And when they reduced the tax rate, the upper rate, they reduced it from 90 to around 70. Tax revenues increased because people are willing to work and invent and innovate and take risks for that additional potential profit. Under the next administration, it was the Reagan administration, it went from 70, around 70 to the 50s, 60s. They did the same thing in Bill Clinton's administration. They lowered from around 50 or so to the 30s. Then it was lowered again. Herbert Walker Bush, and we saw a similar result where you lowered the taxes and you increased your revenue. If you tax somebody at 90%, they're not going to do anything. They're not going to risk their money, their future, the children's savings accounts, nothing. We see the opposite happening in some of the major cities today. And the states that are short on funds, they're raising their taxes on the highest wage earners. And what's happening, we're seeing something called tax migration. People are leaving those areas and they're moving to areas where taxation is more favorable. We see a lot of migration from Texas, from California to Utah, from California and the Northwest. You're seeing a lot of individuals from New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Originally, they were going to Florida because that's a zero income tax state. But if you look at South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, well, South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, that's where a lot of people are moving toward. So when they lose them up north, they're migrating south. Now, when they leave, if we look at the Laffer curve, when they leave the marketplace, the government revenue is going to fall. And when it falls, they still want to provide the same level of services, and they don't have the money to pay for it. So there's a fine line that they have to work with, is that they continue to raise the taxes to people that were going to participate, that were going to contribute, are going to now just walk away. So this is something I would probably print out, and you got the same thing you would see on chapter 7, and it's called the, let's see how they list these specific ones. Okay. They call them the exhibits, the micro chapter exhibits. If you go to the micro links, these are the exhibits. There's a zip file. These are located in Blackboard. So they are available to you.